Today we're going to actually begin a series in the prophets. So we're going to the Old Testament for a bit. And we're going to start in the book of Amos. So you can turn there if you'd like. And we'll do a couple weeks in Amos and in a week or two in Hosea. And we'll hit several different prophets along the way. But I wanted to start with this survey that was taken of an online anger management class. And they asked them, what are the kinds of things that make you angry? And here are the top 10 reasons that these people who are prone to anger gave. Number 10, of course we have to count backwards. Number 10 was people who drive like idiots, especially those that slow down to look at something going on the other side of the freeway. Yeah, which you never recognize that, right? So if there's a slowdown and you're like, is there an accident? And the answer is yes, but it's on the other side, and you're like, well, why is that causing us to slow down? Because everybody's watching it. Number 9, people who use their text messaging while they're having a conversation with you, right? So they're talking to you and they're talking to somebody else at the same time. Number 8, people who talk during movies. All right, don't mess with that. All right, just zip it up. Number 7, companies that make you scroll through a zillion options before you can speak to a live person. Yes, this one bugs me as well. It's like, I just want to talk to somebody. Number 6, people who smoke. I guess because it's, if they're smoking around you. Number 5, people who pass gas on a crowded public elevator. They know they did it, yet they know they can get away with it without being caught. Number 4, gossip. Number 3, large SUVs with just a driver and no passengers. I'm not sure why it's number 3, but hey, it's their list. Number 2, people who are rude. The one who cuts in line, pulls into a parking spot out of turn, or is guilty of number 5 above. And if you've got, I'm going to remind you, but number 5. Number 1. The number 1 reason these people who are dealing with anger say makes them mad is themselves. They said they allow themselves to get mad, and they recognize that it's a choice. It makes them mad when they get mad because they know that they didn't have to get mad. I don't know. That's kind of strange. Well, the funny thing about anger, though, is that each of us has our own buttons. So I know I had to explain this to Petra. She wasn't familiar with this expression, pushing your buttons, right? So this is maybe an American expression. But when there's something that is specific to you that makes you upset, it's your pet peeve, it's your issue that really sets you off, and I know that, and I do that, or I say that, or whatever it is, I know that I'm pushing your button, right? I'm intentionally trying to irritate you. And so that's what it is. So we talk about pushing somebody's buttons. It's something that makes you angry. And I might be perfectly fine with something that is angering you, but there's that other issue that angers me. It's different for each person. You hit that subject, and sometimes I can instantly boil over. It used to be, primarily I found, that it was those who were closest to me that could set me off. And I think it's that buildup of all the previous instances. It used to be my kids. It's gotten a lot better now that they've left the teenage years. But especially when they were teenagers, and they would do that same thing over and over again. They're like, how many times have we talked about this? And you'd be angry very, very quickly. And so we got to recognize that. And so the question this morning that I want to address is, what is it that makes God angry? What is it that we might do that pushes God's button? What is that issue for him? And so I know that for the most part, we like to think about God in very positive terms. We talk about God as loving and forgiving and full of mercy and he's gracious and so forth. And that is all true. But in the prophets, we see a somewhat different picture of God at times. Not that he's not those things, but we also see another side. We see God who at times is forced to take action against his people because they've done something wrong. And so he's a God of judgment. He's a God who wants them to obey him. And so he'll take disciplinary action at times. And so as followers of God, I think it would behoove us to kind of recognize what are those things that perhaps the Israelites did or the people of Judah did that were causing him to be angry and to be upset and to have to do actions. So we're going to start, as I said, in the book of Amos. Now, this book dates to about the 8th century BC. And the beginning of the 8th century was a world in flux. And so we have to recognize that. We've talked before about the Assyrians. You might remember them. They were the world power in the 8th century. But in this particular time that we're talking about, their power was somewhat on the wane. They were the superpower of their day, but on the wane both militarily and economically. And so that allowed some of these smaller nations around them, specifically states like Judah and Israel, to actually fill that power vacuum and to be able to prosper in ways that they couldn't before. And so both countries were able to expand their borders to a size that they hadn't seen since the time of David 2 centuries before. And so it was a new wave of economic prosperity in the land. And there was trade and there was business that began to boom, and the merchants were prospering, and this rich merchant class is on the rise, and the level of wealth and security was at an extent that they hadn't seen in quite some time. They were allowed to achieve what we might call the good life, right? So money and goods began to flow, especially to those who were in power, to those who were of the upper class. But as is always the case, this wealth didn't reach everybody, right? And so the poor and the destitute didn't necessarily benefit from all these changes. It's that same old story we see throughout history, and that's you have the story of the haves and the have-nots. And in those economically prosperous times, the haves just get to have more, and the have-nots still don't have anything, right? That's the way it is. And so notice, as we look at this, this is the world into which Amos is going to speak. And he opens the book this way. The words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, what he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake. And that earthquake, by the way, must have been a doozy because they're using it to mark time. And so like everybody would know, that earthquake. You know, in Nashville it would be before the flood, because we had a flood several years ago, and everybody who's here knows the flood, right? Anyway, 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah, and Jeroboam, the son of Joash, was king of Israel. Now, Uzziah and Jeroboam were two of the longest reigning kings in this day, but most scholars, when they try and date Amos, say, you know, it's probably somewhere between about 760 and 750 BC that we're talking about. So we can narrow it down pretty close. And the key thing to recognize here is that Amos is not a professional prophet. There were people that were professional prophets in those days. They were court prophets. They actually worked in the court for the king, and the king would consult them and say, you know, what's the future hold for me, and should I take this action or not take this action? That's not what Amos is at all. Amos was a shepherd. He was a dresser of sycamore trees. Most likely Amos was from the wrong side of the tracks. And he came from this small town of Tekoa, which is about 12 miles south of Jerusalem. And that's interesting because that's down here in Judah, but Amos is sent to the northern territory that we know as Israel. So he's leaving his own home territory to go up to Israel to speak to them. God gives him a message. And so we're going to look at a little bit of this. The book of Amos opens with a series of oracles. They're very short sayings, and each of these oracles is directed at a particular nation. And so we'll just read the first one here, verses 3 through 5 of chapter 1. First one is against Assyria. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. Because she threshed Gilead with sledges having iron teeth. And I will send fire upon the house of Hazael, and that will consume the fortress of Ben-Hadad. I will break down the gate of Damascus. I will destroy the king who is in the valley of Aven, and the one who holds the scepter in Beth Aden. The people of Aram will go into exile to Kir, says the Lord. Now, if you continue to read, you'd find that each of these oracles begin the same way. For 3 sins, even for 4. And this is simply a stylized way of saying the number 7. And the number 7, of course, is the number of completeness. And so all the nations that surround Israel are then mentioned in the various oracles. So if you watch, I've got a map here, if you go through those oracles, you can just follow them around and you see that each of them are either mentioned by the country or by the city, a prominent city in that country. So all of these nations, you got Syria, you got Phoenicia, Philistia, Ammon, Edom, Moab, and finally, even the sister state of Judah. There should be a map. Is there a map? The next one. Yeah, there it is. Oh, it's kind of small. Sorry. Those of you who are younger with good eyes can maybe see it. Otherwise, it's hopeless. So Amos begins his speech against the nations around Israel. Again, the northern portion that we're talking about. And what you have to recognize here is that as Israel, because Amos is speaking this to Israel, these oracles. We're not exactly sure how these oracles are meant to get to these various nations around them, but maybe he ended up traveling there, maybe they're sent by messenger, maybe it's just for Israel's benefit. But Amos is speaking this, and Israel's hearing these messages, these oracles. And Israel begins to cheer. You can imagine this, right? Because what's happening here, at least in their minds, is that God has finally taken notice of Israel's enemies. Because all of these nations that are being mentioned are ones that at one point or other have either attacked Israel or they've caused problems for Israel, they've harassed Israel, and so now they finally earn God's wrath. God's going to do something about it, and the Israelites are like, yes, finally! This is tremendous. This is great. You go, God. We want you to do that. And so these nations, in the Israelites' mind, well deserve these judgments and these condemnations. And the Israelites are so happy that God is finally going to do something about it. And as we look at the charges against these various nations, we see some rather horrific abuses by them. Right? And so, for example, Damascus is mentioned here. It's a key city of Syria. And it's charged with threshing Gilead. Now, of course, a lot of the imagery sometimes in the prophets is lost on us because it's talking about things of daily life that they would have been familiar with. So threshing was an agricultural practice of the day that everybody was familiar with. A threshing sled was basically a wooden board that had either sharp stones embedded in it or maybe pieces of metal, and then you would take that sled and you would run it back and forth over the grain to break it apart. And so the imagery here is that Damascus has done that to the people of Gilead, that they have threshed them, that the war machine of Syria has attacked Gilead and has crushed them and abused them and has torn the people apart. And so that's what they're guilty of. Gaza is another one mentioned. A city in Philistia is charged with taking whole communities captive. Ammon is guilty of ripping open, it says, the bellies of pregnant women. This is a form of genocide that was fairly common in the ancient day to make sure that your enemies would not be able to grow up and attack you later on. It's cruel behavior. And in each instance, God is going to hold these nations accountable. Now, recognize this. None of these nations are in covenant relationship with God. None of them have the law. But God expects from all of His creation at least a basic level of decency because He created them. And so they might not have specific laws that He has given them to obey, but these are crimes against humanity itself, against creation itself, and so God will hold them accountable for that. For these fundamental, there's a fundamental moral standard that all nations are held accountable for. And so the standard has been violated and they're going to be punished. Now, as the sermon builds going from one nation to another, you can imagine the Israelites cheering even more. You know, yes, Damascus, yes, Ammon, get those Edomites, and Moab too, oh yeah, this is great, this is wonderful. So in each instance, you know, they're getting really, really excited. But Amos doesn't stop after the seventh oracle. That's the problem. He saves his last and his most detailed condemnation for the people of Israel itself, for those very ones who were cheering. And so suddenly the cheering stops, because now God's wrath is no longer directed at these outsiders, at these enemies. It's directed squarely at the Israelites, God's own people. So let's look at the pronouncements of Amos against his people. The oracle against Israel, we can divide into 3 sections. We're going to take it section by section. Look at the first section. This is chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. They sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as upon the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines. And so, although each of the various nations have charges leveled against them, have one charge leveled against them, here with Israel there are 4 specific charges. So I want to very briefly outline these. What is it? Because that's our question. What is it that is making God mad? That's making him angry, wrathful? What has Israel done that causes God to act? So, number 1, they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's actually 2 suggestions here. Some view this as a statement as a reference to the court system. The ancient court systems were notoriously unjust in many ways, favorable, of course, to the rich versus the poor, and so you could easily bribe a judge, or just because he was of the same class as you, would also find in favor of the rich person over the poor. And so some view this as perhaps a bribe being given. But I think there's actually something else going on here. I think a better interpretation is that it's referring to a debt that is owed. You see, throughout the ages, the rich have been able to use debt to subjugate poor people. What happens is there's always, especially in agricultural cultures, there's always a time where things get tough, where a famine arises, where there's drought, and the farmer is not able to produce enough grain to sustain himself, and he must borrow money from the rich. And the moment that happens, he becomes a debt slave. And it's very, very difficult from that point on to ever get out of debt because of the interest rates that are being charged. And so what happens here is, what we seem to be having going on here, is that when this poor person cannot pay a debt, they are then sold to recoup the loss by the rich person. And so Amos's charge, most likely, is that the rich have sold the poor for as small a debt as a pair of sandals. That even for such a small debt, they haven't forgiven it, they haven't been patient with it, but they've sold them into slavery. Number 2, they trample on the heads of the poor as upon the dust of the ground, and they deny justice to the oppressed. Again, this accusation addresses the humiliation, perhaps even the physical abuse meted out against the poor people. Poor are treated as second-class citizens, those who don't have the same kind of rights and privileges as the ruling class, as those who have wealth. There might even be a suggestion here that the poor are being physically ejected from the courts. See, the judgments were held at the city gate, and so the poor might be coming to the city gate and they're cast aside, and so we're not even here to case. Number 3, father and son profane the same girl, and so profane my holy name. Some have suggested that this is about sacred prostitution, but it's far more likely that it's talking about father and son using the same female slave. In the ancient world, slavery was, of course, a horrible practice, and slaves in the ancient world had no freedoms, and it was very, very common for slaves to be used for the sexual gratification of their masters. And so the accusation here is that both father and son are using perhaps the same female slave. And so here Amos is decrying not only the sexual exploitation of this female slave, but also the fact that both the father and the son are using this woman in this fashion. So it's a violation of the law for that to actually happen. And then number 4, they lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines. Once again, Amos is talking about debt practice here. You see, the law allowed the wealthy who were owed a debt to take a person's garment given in pledge, so that the poor person had given their wrap to the rich person as a pledge that I'll return the debt. But you were supposed to, and you got to remember this is a smaller community, everybody knows everybody, right? And they're not living far away. But at night, the rich person was supposed to give the garment back, because for a poor person, that was their only protection against the cold. They slept in that garment. That was in essence, their bed. And so you give it back to them, and then the next morning they give it to you again as a pledge. But they're not giving them back. They're holding on to these things in pledge, and they're not returning them as they're supposed to each night. And so Amos is saying that this is unjust. And the irony here is that Amos says that these practices of abuse, they collected fines for this, and that they brought those to the temple. Now, they're not talking about the temple in Jerusalem, by the way. We're in North Israel. And North Israel had 2 temples of its own, unauthorized, unholy temples that God condemned as well. So that's a whole different issue. They were guilty for that as well. All kinds of things they were guilty for. And so the irony here is that you're taking these fines and you're putting them into this temple. And all of this is making God angry. So what happens here is that they missed the heart of God. That they missed what God is really concerned about. And they haven't recognized what makes God angry. And so although the nations around Israel have been charged with all these kind of general inhumanity against mankind of things, Israel is being held accountable for more specific violations against the poor and against the oppressed, against the weak and against the vulnerable of society. And Israel is held to a higher standard because Israel is supposed to know better. They are in covenant relationship with God. God has communicated to them through the law what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to know better than the nations around them. They're supposed to know the heart of God. All right, second section, verses 9 through 12. Amos now describes the reasons why God expected more. I destroyed the Amorite before them, though he was tall as the cedars and strong as the oaks. I destroyed his fruit above and his root below. I brought you up out of Egypt, and I led you 40 years in the desert to give you the land of the Amorites. I also raised up prophets from among your sons and Nazarites from among your young men. Is this not true, people of Israel? Declares the Lord. But you made the Nazarites drink wine, and commanded the prophets not to prophesy. So Amos is referring back, of course, now to the exodus from Egypt and to the conquest of the land of Canaan. And he's reminding them of how God had treated them when they themselves were poor and oppressed and dispossessed. How God took these helpless slaves in Egypt and he rescued them, and he brought them out, and he took care of them, and he rescued them from bondage, and he gave them a land of their own. And they were tasked with living as an alternative community. Their job was to show the nations around them, here's what it looks like when you are living in communion with God. And they were to do that by treating the poor people with respect and with justice. They were those who were supposed to lift up the weak and to exalt the humble. They were supposed to take care of the orphan and the widow. They were supposed to show the world what the heart of God looked like. Yet the Israelites had forgotten all of that. They'd forgotten who they were supposed to be. And the very figures who were sent to remind them, the Nazarites who had taken special vows, and the prophets who were sent to give them messages, those very people, they shut up. And they would not let do their ministry. And so God says, in the third section, judgment is coming. Look at verses 13 and follow. Now then, I will crush you as a cart crushes when loaded with grain. The swift will not escape. The strong will not muster their strength, and the warrior will not save his life. The archer will not stand his ground. The fleet-footed soldier will not get away. and the horseman will not save his life. Even the bravest warriors will flee naked on that day, declares the Lord. Israel will be defeated in battle, and God will not protect his people. They will be punished, just like the nations around them are punished. Now, you might say, thanks for the history lesson. That's great. Really appreciate learning a little bit more about Amos. But what in the world does that have to do with us? We're not guilty of these things, are we? Well, as we stand as observers of this scene from the distant past, we might shake our heads and, in kind of assimilation with Israel and say, I recognize as we see her jubilation turn to horror and despondency as God's judgment is against them, that was a bad thing. And we can feel for that. But are we really that different in our practices when we really look at it? Now, the specifics might be different, but the principles seem to be the same. Have we not, in many ways, taken the path of Israel? And I'm speaking specifically as the nation of America now and our practices, as a democracy, as a nation of specifically capitalism. We revel in our progress and our enlightenment, and we think that this is the best system in the world, which in some ways it is, but that it should be exported to all nations because it is so good and so blessed. But when we look at these practices, we have to recognize that we've been blessed in ways that other parts of the world can only dream about. That there's a wealth here and a richness here. And we call ourselves a Christian nation. But there's so many ways in which we violate the principles and practices of Jesus' teachings. You see, we've learned to be good businessmen and businesswomen, but when the guiding principle is profit, we run the risk of ignoring the heart of God. And we run the risk of not seeing the ways in which the lives of the weak and the helpless are sometimes ground into the dust by the capitalist machine. Although many in our country would claim that salvation lies in democracy, salvation of the world lies in democracy, we know that our salvation as Christians is in Christ alone. It always has been and always will be. And we've been called to follow him. And one of the most persistent underlying principles in Jesus' teachings is the concern for the outcast, for the poor, for the oppressed, for the weak, for the sick, for the vulnerable of society. It is a message found throughout both Testaments. It pervades the prophets, not just Amos. And it's all throughout Jesus' own teachings. But too often as Christians, I think our heroes and our models are those who have achieved worldly success and financial gain. And at one level, let me just qualify this here. There's nothing wrong with making a profit. There's nothing wrong with money and business success and all that kind of stuff. What I'm calling us to recognize is that Christ wants us to think about other kinds of things as our primary goal. Number one, how is that profit being achieved? Is it at the expense of others? And number two, what are the purposes for which that money that we're gaining are being used? I think there are times where a very good business decision is not in the interest of Christ. And so you have to choose which we follow. We must decide what's our primary identity. Business person or Christian? Because they're not always equivalent. And so when business becomes purely a matter of numbers and not people, we are no longer following the way of Christ. But let me move, as we get toward the end here, one last, maybe more personal kind of application, because I think most of us here perhaps are not large into business,